Imagine a time when medieval culture of torture and executions clashed with the humanist culture of exploration, scientific discoveries and invention. You have the time of John Donne.
Figuring out how to remove myself.
Donne was born of a Catholic family in a Protestant country. Part of a recusant family, his mother was the niece of the Catholic martyr Thomas More, and his own brother Henry was imprisoned while at Oxford for harbouring a Catholic priest. Henry died while in prison, probably from the plague, making the total count of 11 members of John Donne's family dying either by execution or in exile for being Catholic. After studying at Oxford, he read law at Lincoln's Inn, one of the top legal schools of the country. From there, he went on some sea adventures, signing up with the famously boisterous and energetic Earl of Essex, and they raided the Spanish in the Azores and in Cadiz. Returning from there, he took up employment with Sir Thomas Egerton, who was the keeper of the Great Seal in the court, one of the top legal powers in the country. But unfortunately for John, he fell in love with his boss's niece. They married in secret. Egerton was furious, and John was given the sack and put in prison for a time. He was able to prove that his marriage to Anne was legitimate, and eventually they fathered 12 children. He began to write anti-Catholic texts which caught the attention of the court of King James I. He was eventually given an honorary doctorate in divinity, which led to a career in the ministry, eventually becoming Dean of St. Paul's, where his sermons were the talk of the town. His sermons were astonishing. People flocked to listen to him preach, and they're still in print today. He wrote erotic and divine poetry, much of which was unpublished in his lifetime. After circulating in manuscript form, his poems were eventually collected and put to press in 1633, a couple of years after his death. This makes it difficult to know when any of his poems were written. We have a few biographical details, and perhaps some of those can point to a time when the poems were written, but they circulated in manuscript form long before they were published. There are two things that occupied the mind of John Donne, and he often conflated them poetically in dazzling ways. They are love and death. In the poem written on the 1-year anniversary of his marriage to Anne, he imagines them being buried together in a grave. And in a later poem called The Relic, he imagines a gravedigger digging up those bones while their souls go on into eternal glory. He kept a memento mori hanging in his hallway, a picture of himself he commissioned, dead and draped in a funeral sheet, to remind himself that the grave was never too far away. He's famous for the lines, "For whom the bell tolls, and it always tolls for thee." Whenever a funeral happens or someone has died, we are to remember that our own death is never far away. A quick side note about manuscript culture and the circulation of poems and other literary forms in manuscript in groups known as coteries. We know that John Donne belonged to a few circles. One of them was the Fraternity of the Cyrenaical Gentlemen that met at the Mermaid Tavern the first Friday of every month. It was attended by John Donne, Ben Jonson, John Fletcher, Thomas Coriat, and others of Shakespeare's circle. And so it's entirely possible that Shakespeare also attended on occasion himself. Ben Jonson later took up residence at the Devil of St. Dunstan's on Fleet Street, where he set up the Apollo Club, and John Donne is one of the 14 members of the Mitre Tavern Club that was written about by John Hoskins in his poem called Convivium Philosophicum. John Donne also penned verses to Lucy Russell, Countess of Bedford, who herself had her own circle of writers that would meet at her house. This included Samuel Daniel and John Chapman. Donne wrote the poem Twickenham Gardens about the Bedford residence. It includes these lines: "Blasted with sighs and surrounded with tears, hither I come to seek the spring, and at mine eyes and mine ears receive such balms as else cure everything." Which is to say that Donne was active in several of London's literary clubs and societies, the ones at Lincoln's Inn, where he studied law, and at various taverns, and at Twickenham. I'm indebted to Michelle O'Callaghan's The English Wits, Literature and Sociability in Early Modern England. She writes, "Learned play at the universities and Inns of Court incorporated performers and audience into a humanist community whose primary bonds of association were those of education and intellect. Revelling thus provided these educational institutions with a means of publicly displaying collective academic capital and making claims to a cultural hegemony." His manuscript poems were part of a social interaction where writers would gather and exchange their ideas. They'd also receive corrections and answers and responses, and sometimes set each other a challenge to write about a Latin quote or phrase. This convivial intellectual exchange of tavern literature is the environment from which poets like Donne took their inspiration, often taking one poet's works and reframing or restructuring them. John Davis of Hereford was in Donne's circle and wrote an epigram to him which included, "I know thy pen hath rightly done, which doing right makes bright the name of Donne." So in this video I've reviewed his biographical information and some of the context from which Donne and his works emerged. In my next video I'll be looking at the first of the poems in this group, and in future videos I'll be looking at a number of his poems which came out in 1633.